Hello and welcome back to our channel NPA Discovery, where we uncover the most dramatic and thought-provoking true stories from history. Today, we bring you a haunting story that has fascinated the world for decades, the kidnapping of John Paul Getty III, grandson of one of the richest men who ever lived. But this isn't just a story about money and crime. It's a story about family, betrayal, survival, and the heavy burden of wealth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories that matter, stories that challenge what we think we know about fame, fortune, and the human spirit. Now, let's get into it. John Paul Getty III was born into unimaginable wealth on November 4, 1956. He was the namesake of the Getty dynasty, an empire built on oil and the ruthless business savvy of his grandfather, J. Paul Getty Sr. But even in this glittering world of privilege, young John Paul didn't grow up shielded from dysfunction. His parents' marriage crumbled early on, and he was largely raised by his mother in Rome, Italy. Rome was, at the time, a center of cultural and political upheaval. Getty found himself enchanted by the counterculture, roaming the streets with artists, political radicals, and misfits. He lived a bohemian lifestyle that clashed dramatically with his family's expectations. While his grandfather was focused on building an empire brick by dollar-shaped brick, John Paul was more interested in painting, poetry, and rebellion. He was expelled from multiple schools for his behavior, and he carried himself more like a rebel poet than a billionaire in waiting. This tension between privilege and rebellion is what makes this story so compelling. Imagine being raised in castles but yearning to be part of a world that rejects wealth, status, and order. Getty III embodied that conflict, and it would define his entire life. He became close to two older German twins, Gisela and Huda, women who exposed him further to the undercurrents of radical life. Eventually, the three moved in together, and Getty started slipping deeper into a lifestyle full of uncertainty and danger. Rumors swirled that he had even discussed staging his own kidnapping as a way to get money out of his tight-fisted family. This brings us to the chilling night of July 10, 1973, in the heart of Rome. At 3 a.m., Getty was kidnapped by men who meant business. He was thrown into a van, blindfolded, and transported to the rugged countryside of Calabria, southern Italy. And this was no staged abduction. These were members of the notorious 'Ndrangheta crime syndicate, one of the most dangerous mafia organizations in the world. The kidnappers demanded $17 million. That's more than $120 million in today's money. John Paul Getty Sr., the family patriarch and arguably the richest man in the world at the time, refused to pay. He famously said, "I have 14 other grandchildren. If I pay one penny now, then I will have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." Those weren't just cold words, they were a death sentence for his grandson. John Paul III was confined in a cave. His captors initially tried to keep things relatively civil, but when they realized the Gettys weren't taking the threat seriously, the brutality began. They played Russian roulette with him. They beat him. They stripped away any dignity he had left. In desperation, they sent a letter along with a severed ear to an Italian newspaper, reducing the ransom to $3.2 million. The letter read, chillingly, "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get some money within 10 days, then the other ear will arrive." Eventually, Getty Sr. agreed to pay $2.2 million, just enough to be tax deductible. The remaining amount was loaned to Getty's father, with 4% interest. Even when it came to his own flesh and blood, money came first. John Paul Getty III was released on December 15, 1973. He was found at a gas station, disoriented, traumatized, and a year older. His ear was gone, and the emotional scars ran far deeper. But even as he returned to society, the damage was permanent. Part 2, a life rewritten by trauma and tragedy. Freedom may have come, but it didn't come free, and it certainly didn't bring peace. After his release, Getty returned to a world that was more complicated than the one he'd left behind. He was no longer just the rebellious heir of an oil fortune, he had become a symbol. A symbol of excess. A symbol of wealth without wisdom. A symbol of what happens when money is prioritized over humanity. Despite the trauma, Getty attempted to return to normalcy. He married Gisela, the woman who had been with him before the abduction. She had been pregnant during his captivity, and shortly after their wedding, she gave birth to their son, Balthazar Getty, the same Balthazar who would later find fame in Hollywood, but even fatherhood couldn't undo the damage. Getty had changed. Deep down, the cave hadn't released him. It still held his mind captive. His behavior became more erratic. He struggled with substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, anything to dull the memories that haunted him. The painkillers that were initially used to treat the infection from his severed ear turned into a lifelong addiction. Getty's foray into acting provided a glimmer of hope. He appeared in a couple of films in the early 80s, including Wim Wenders' experimental movie The State of Things, which ironically explored themes of despair and disconnection. But the real world proved to be too heavy. In 1981, at the young age of 25, Getty's world came crashing down once again. A combination of alcohol and drugs led to a catastrophic stroke. It left him blind, unable to speak, and paralyzed, a quadriplegic, permanently wheelchair-bound. The tragedy didn't end there. The Getty family, despite their enormous fortune, struggled to care for him. His wife, already overwhelmed, moved away. His mother tried to step in, but she didn't have the financial resources. His father, John Paul Jr., resisted covering medical expenses, even though he was receiving millions annually through his trust fund. It wasn't until Getty's mother sued him that financial support was finally provided. What does it say about a family when love must be enforced by law? Getty spent the rest of his life disabled, dependent on others, and largely out of the public eye. He died in 2011, at the age of 54, in the home of his father in England. At last, he was in the care of the man who had once turned away. Whether there was forgiveness between them, we may never know. John Paul Getty III's story is a haunting reminder that fortune does not equal freedom. That trauma, once inflicted, lingers. And that the true cost of wealth may be paid not in dollars, but in relationships, suffering, and the human soul. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe. Join us again for more true stories that expose the hidden side of fame, power, and the human spirit. Because sometimes, the greatest tragedies are the ones we never see coming. By the time he entered his 30s, John Paul Getty III had lived more lives than most people could imagine. But instead of wisdom, what followed was loneliness, chronic pain, and a sense of abandonment that no amount of inheritance could heal. After the stroke left him partially blind, unable to speak, and confined to a wheelchair, his life became a quiet tragedy, one not measured by headlines but by the slow erosion of his identity. Here was a man who had once walked the streets of Rome, the enfant terrible of a billionaire empire, reduced to silence and dependence. And what made it more heartbreaking? His own family, flush with oil wealth, seemed more comfortable turning a blind eye than extending a helping hand. His mother Abigail, to her everlasting credit, remained a constant presence. She advocated fiercely for her son, emotionally and legally. She took the Gettys to court to demand financial support for her son's ongoing medical needs. The court ruled in her favor, compelling John Paul Getty Jr., a man who enjoyed more than $20 million a year from his trust, to finally pay his share. But one can't help but ask, why did it take a lawsuit for a father to support his son? There's an irony so sharp it cuts. John Paul Jr., who had once failed to protect his son, was later knighted for his philanthropic contributions. The public saw a generous man. His son saw a stranger who chose wealth over warmth. Silence over support. Meanwhile, John Paul Getty III became a recluse. He lived away from the public eye, often shuttled between caregivers and family estates. At times, he was cared for by staff hired through court-ordered funds. His wife, Gisela, had long since returned to Europe, starting over in Germany. While she and Getty remained on amicable terms, the emotional toll of his condition had effectively ended any hope of a romantic future. John Paul Getty III passed away on February 5, 2011, at the age of 54. He died at his father's estate in Buckinghamshire, England, a place he had once been estranged from, now serving as his final refuge. Whether there was reconciliation in those final days between father and son, no one knows. But his death wasn't met with silence. The world, which had long been fascinated by his kidnapping, responded with renewed interest. Newspapers retold his story. Documentaries revisited the trauma. Films like All the Money in the World dramatized his ordeal for new generations. But the real question was no longer about ransom or money, it was about what kind of world allows something so horrific to happen under the gaze of so much wealth. Let us not remember John Paul Getty III simply as the boy whose ear was cut off to demand payment. Let's remember him as the boy who was failed by the very people who should have fought hardest for him. As the young man whose rebellion wasn't just about mischief, but a deep yearning to be seen, heard, and loved for who he was, not for his last name. In the end, his story serves as a cautionary tale, not about kidnapping, but about indifference. A reminder that wealth cannot buy compassion, that a family name cannot guarantee a family's love, and that trauma, if left untreated, can grow roots deeper than money ever can. We hope you found meaning in this powerful, painful, and unforgettable story. If you believe these stories deserve to be told with care and honesty, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us continue exploring the human truths hidden behind fame, money, and history.